Hello and welcome, dear viewers, to yet another episode of Warhammer Lore with me, Grey Hunter, where at the request of a viewer we will be tackling the Lizardmen next. Possibly the most unique of all the playable armies in Warhammer Fantasy, the Lizardmen are completely alien. Taking a lot of inspiration from the Inca, Aztec and Mayan societies of actual history, they inhabit the New World, in air quotes, of Lustria, a jungle-infested continent on the other side of what the Lizardmen call the World Pond and everybody else calls the Great Ocean. The most powerful magic users of the Warhammer world, they outshine even the elves in their magical prowess, and the Lizardmen make for an interesting faction, especially in the lore. So let's take a look at their origins. The Lizardmen are the oldest race in the Warhammer world, and they're a very curious faction. As the name suggests, they're the lizards, and in the case of Slann mage priests, they're giant toads. The Lizardmen represent the first creations of the Old Ones, or the creator gods of the Warhammer world. After the Fall, which is an event where chaos seeped into the world through the warp gates that the Old Ones had built, they left the world, and the Slann took up a caretaker role, leading the Lizardmen in the following of the Great Plan. What exactly the Great Plan is, well, that's never really been elaborated on, and it's kind of left mainly up to the interpretation of the Slann. They pursue this goal with ruthless efficiency and an almost alien drive, which makes sense as they're so different from the rest of the Warhammer races. Even the Skaven have a little bit more in common with, say, men. They have what is essentially a caste society, with leaders, warriors and servants all being of different species, which makes them different again from most of the Warhammer races, although the Greenskins and the Ogres do kind of have a similar society set up. And onwards to history. The Lizardmen, in their self-imposed removal from the world at large, don't have a ton of history in the lore. Instead, they're more shrouded in the mystery of what exactly it is they are. The Old Ones, as we discussed before, were the creators, and they're actually an interstellar traveling race that journeyed to the world of Warhammer on their ships. Supposedly, these ships were capable of moving unimaginable distances in a mere heartbeat, so, hyperspace is kind of the implication there. Once they arrived, they fiddled about with the planet, terraforming bits of it to suit them, and creating their servants, the first generation of Slann, who were the most powerful magic users in the Warhammer world. They subsequently created 4 more generations of these Slann, and they expanded across the world, founding temple cities as part of a grid of power, raising giant structures all over the world, and even more gigantic structures called warp gates over the north and south pole of the world. They made their primary home in the jungles of Lustria. The Lizardmen, which were created to assist the Slann in their endeavors, came from the primitive life forms native to Lustria, and they were created to be warriors in the case of the Saurus, and in the case of the Skinks, as servants. Dedicated to order and progress, the Old Ones forged the world into their ideal, and they even moved a bit of a continent from Lustria to the Old World south of Necakhara. And then the Fall happens. For about 5,000 years in the lore, the Old Ones had managed the world, reforming it into an image that suited them better. Some life forms were nurtured as experiments, and so flourished things like the elves, dwarves, and men. Others, the Saurus eliminated, because they didn't fit into the plan. The Old Ones, however, weren't the only thing with such great power out there. Dun dun dun! What would become known as chaos began seeping through their warp gates, beginning a titanic struggle between the Old Ones and this new raw power. The gates themselves were destroyed, whether that was by design or by accident is unknown, but the result was pieces of them being thrown across the world as comets smashing into the ground, and some of them gathering together in the sky, forming a second moon. This stuff was Warpstone, what the Skaven crave, and it's powerfully infused with magic. So, yeah. One of the moons of the Warhammer world is a massive chunk of warpstone. Also, as a result of this destruction, chaos energy ran rampant and tore holes in the fabric of reality, the largest of which was in the northern wastes, so the chaos homeland, basically. Demons poured through these tears, and the Old Ones were suddenly gone. Whether destroyed by the onslaught of chaos or simply abandoning the world to its fate, the Old Ones vanished at this point. The armies of Saurus held off the daemons on the field of physical battle, but the Slann were suddenly overwhelmed by the strength of the magic of chaos, and many of them died fighting it. Fighting for their very survival, the Slann and Lizardmen were pushed back into the deep jungles of Lustria, their temple cities coming under direct attack as daemons threatened to overrun the world. Zahutek, Chaqua, Zotl, and countless other cities fell, and the Slann mage priests died in droves in an attempt to hold off the onslaught, as it weakened the grids of power holding everything together. One of the Slann manages to hold the grid together in his area, although some of the outlying cities are left to fend for themselves, some of them surviving as powerful leaders such as Lord Mazdamundi protect them, others falling. One of the most southern in Lustria actually slips into the ocean, disappearing from history, although it turns up every once in a while as a kind of Atlantis analogue. The Southlands themselves are cut off entirely as the Old Ones vanish, communications falling apart, but Lord Chakotay succeeds in destroying the demonic legions besieging the Southland cities, although he does lose his life in the process. And it's at this point that for once the elves did something you could actually call kind of decent. and thoughtful, and maybe even selfless, although it was for their own survival as well, when they created a powerful vortex at Ulthuan, which trapped the majority of magical energy that was allowing the daemons to stay corporeal and relieving the threat to the world at least temporarily. The elves, being one of the races nurtured by the Old Ones, were taught the ways of magic by the Slann and aided by them, this knowledge allowing them to pull off this feat of magic. The Slann, with this respite, set about attempting completion of the Great Plan in isolation. As I said before, what exactly the Great Plan was, or is, well, that's unknown, but the Slann work towards their goals whatever they may be, hoping for a return of the Old Ones. In one instance of trying to complete this plan, the Slann moved the continents a little bit, interpreting this as the will of the Old Ones, which destroyed several dwarf holds in the World's Edge Mountains and sent the Dwarven Empire into decline. That's right, the Age of Strife for the Dwarves was created by some Slann deciding the mountains weren't quite straight enough. The Skaven make an appearance in Lostria, taking up residence in one of the fallen cities of the Lizardmen and fortifying it. The clan in question, Pestilens, spreads plague throughout Lostria and becomes the preeminent enemy of the Lizardmen, beginning a conflict that lasts for thousands of years. The Elves too make appearances, the High Elves exploring and eventually leaving, while the Dark Elves plunder fallen Lizardmen cities for goods. In the Southlands, so the place just south of Nehekhara, the Lizardmen cities still standing engage in a conflict with the Priest Kings of Nehekhara, as their realm borders the edge of that which the Priest Kings claim to be their own. The Lizardmen of the Southlands also occasionally hire themselves out as mercenaries to the realms of men, although they don't fare that well if they're taken too far north into the arid climates. The few Slann that actually remain in the Southlands are of the youngest generations, and try as they might, they cannot restore contact with their brethren in Lostria. In the year that Sigmar is born back in the Old World, a twin-tailed comet sails across the sky. Now you might be asking yourself, Greyhunter, what the hell does this have to do with Lizardmen? Well, it heralds the spawning of many red-crested skinks and the rise of a cult of Sotek. These lizard men spread their faith across Lostria with zeal, and after the pestilence presence in Lostria is removed when serpents infest the tunnels they live in, apparently at the behest of the lizard men's gods, Sotek is heralded as chief among them. But this is not the last time that newcomers will stake out a presence on the Lostrian continent. The lizard men, angered by the constant Dark Elf incursions, invade Naggaroth, located on the northern edge of Lostria, so this is the place that the Dark Elves ran away to after the whole sundering thing. They go to get back sacred artifacts. Interestingly, they don't actually raise the place, they just take what they wanted to grab and leave again. In the south of the continent, the vampire Luther Harkon washes ashore, and he begins the creation of a realm of the undead as the bodies of sailors killed off on the coast join him, which comes to be known as the Vampire Coast. Yeah, there's a coast of vampire pirates. He sends incursions into the Lostrian interior and sails a fleet of ghostly pirate ships, preying on those who venture too close. These are not the only presences of newcomers, however, as the Norsemen found the colony of Skeggi and they too begin probing the jungle for booty. Even later in 1492 by the Imperial reckoning, Chilean merchant prince and explorer Marco Colombo, wonder who he's meant to be, comes ashore and witnesses a Dark Elf army being defeated by the Lizardmen. This prompts a wave of colonizations to occur, with several townships being formed on the coast, some of them surviving, others being eradicated for their temerity. One, Cadavo, is destroyed 3 times by the Lord Mazamundi before the interlopers finally leave. In more recent days, the Lizardmen invaded the Isles of Albion. It's a small little place that doesn't really have much in the lore, but it's kind of important. Attempting to expand their realms, but the threat of chaos resurgent causes them to pull back and prepare for yet another round of fighting chaos for the preservation of the world. In the End Times lore that Games Workshop has released, the cliffhanger ending that used to be there has kind of been resolved, though not quite exactly as you might expect, perhaps. The next little bit of the history section will be a little brief overview. The actions of each special character will be dealt with in their particular section. The Slann ability to predict the future becomes clouded. If you think Fall of the Jedi stuff, you've got it about right. Essentially blind, the Slann act on their last vision of a massive Daemon invasion, and so they tailored the defences of Lostria to guard against this eventuality. Unluckily for them, though, the Skaven are the ones who rock up to ruin the day. Clan Pestilens. Fucking Pestilens! Seeking out their vengeance, and because they aren't daemons, the defences have no effect. Warpstone meteors begin flying towards Lostria, and though the Slann are able to stop most of them, they're rendered useless by going into comas all across the board from the effort. Turns out that the reason for these meteors was the Skaven mages called Grey Seers, who tried to pull the moon made out of Warpstone closer so they could get a Warpstone fix to feed their addictions. They just casually altered the path of a moon. Fucking junkies. So cities fall and Lord Mazdamundi orders the evacuation of Lostria before he dies, trying to stop the meteors. How does he do this, you ask? Well, it turns out that in the temple cities the lizard men had these things called Exodus engines, and they board them, preparing for a trip out into space, the final frontier, in their flying pyramids. So basically the lizard men noped the hell out of the planet and became nicer versions of the Goa'uld, seeing as they don't insert mind lizards into people's brains. Well, They don't yet, anyway. So now we come to those people who are kind of relevant, but massively overcosted on the tabletop. Special characters. So first up is Lord Croak. This guy, apart from having a terrible pun for a name because he's a giant toad, is the most powerful of all the Slann ever. He also held the distinction of being the first Slann to be spawned, so he's a pretty big deal. During the fall, he fought at this city called Itza, holding off the Daemons pretty much by himself. Finally, the Daemons made it to him, but it took over a dozen bloodthirsters, who were pretty much the top dogs of Khorne, to destroy his body. And even after they did that, his spirit fought on for the good of the city, saving it by murdering the crap out of the Daemons. So now, mummified, he sits on his throne for a few thousand years, being brought to battle in times of dire need, his spirit fighting on. Come the end times, when the Skaven blow up the goddamn moon, he senses a great disturbance in the Force when Mazda Mundi dies, and his spirit goes full power mode, sacrificing himself for the final time to keep the destruction caused by the moon to Lustria and the Southlands. The whole place is just burned to ash and slag, so the Lizardmen can't go home again, and seeing as he's dead after that stunt, I guess in the next edition, he's not going to be a playable choice or a big deal because the story's progressed. Lord Mazda Mundi. He's Lord Croak's former Padawan back in the good old days when the old ones were still around. He's the oldest living Slann, or at least he was until the end times killed him. He basically sat around meditating for a few thousand years, occasionally rousing himself to tell the vampire Luther Harkon to get off his lawn, and to destroy Cadazo a couple of times before those guys got the message. During the end times, he alone stops a lot of the warpstone chunks flying towards the ground. Some of these things are continent-sized. He fixes it himself. This kills him, but fortunately for the Lizardmen, he was able to get the evac order out first, so they took to the giant flying pyramids. Kroq-Gar, the last defender of Zotul. He's over 8,000 years old, so while Lord Croak and Mazda Mundi were about 10,000 years old, he's no slouch, he's pretty good. He's a mighty Saurus, and he's the best general that the Lizardmen have, seeing as he has millennia of experience under his belt. He takes his moniker from being the last survivor of the army of Zotul, which he led in a guerrilla battle against the Daemons during the fall, riding his Carnosaur Grimlock, which is basically a giant dinosaur that, eats people. He fights on the front line, and he led invasions to Albion before the bad things transpired. In the End Times lore, he leads an army to relieve the Lizardmen cities, killing Lord Skrolk of the Skaven in personal combat, although Grimlock got killed during that. Last known, he appears to still be alive and taking names, so the last defender of Zotul still has some ass-kicking left to do. Chakax, bearing the title of Eternity Warden, this guy's the personal bodyguard of the Slann in Zlanhupek. He stands vigil while they meditate, and he's been known to keep watch for centuries at a time, so he's a very, very impressive security guard, staying awake that long. He's a pretty cool character. He carries a giant mace made out of what they call Starstone, which I guess is supposed to be like a meteor thing, and he's killed countless thousands of people with it. In the end times, he gets in the way of a bunch of Skaven assassins set to take out the Slann of the city. By himself, he kills all of them, even after they stab him in the chest with one of the most virulent poison-coated blades they have. It does absolutely nothing to faze him, and he just beats the crap out of them with his big two-handed mace. Tenhuwain. Yes, Tenhuwain. The prophet of Sotek, he predicted the arrival of the Serpent God, which was heralded, as we said earlier, by the twin-tailed comet. Saving the population of Chakwa before it fell from pestilent disease, he achieved a cult following and prosecuted a war against the Skaven with zeal. This was unusual because he was a skink, one of the servant race, and they generally don't fight in the same fashion that the Saurus or Slann do. However, his achievements meant that he did have some power and a pretty good bunch of street cred, and he managed to bargain for some freedom for skinks. Being a short-lived species, it's unknown whether, like the Fey Enchantress, there has been only one Tenhuwan, or if there's been many, but the Prophet of Sotek still sometimes appears on the battlefield to lead Lizardmen to victory. Gorok! Like Kroq-Gar, he has a funky name. An Albinosaurus, he's an exemplar of combat marked by his coloring and being the sole spawn when he arrived as a future champion. So he wields a mace and shield supposedly passed down from the time of the old ones, and he's pretty badass actually. He goes out and destroys people, and occasionally the Slann will do a whole Harbinger thing and a Shub direct control. Oxyotl, a chameleon skink, so he's basically a super scout guy. He was present during the fall, so almost 10,000 years ago. In one of the doomed cities, the Slann mage priest attempted to summon what was pretty much a mini supernova to rid the city of Daemons. Instead, he managed to open a portal to the realms of chaos and get the city sucked in. Good job breaking it, hero. So Oxyotl manages to stay alive because he's a chameleon skink, so he kind of blends in with his background, and he hunts in the realms of chaos until he manages to find a way back out, emerging 7,000 years after he left. So he is, by far, the oldest skink in existence. A scout of immense ability, he continues to lead his skink brethren in their fight. Teto Echo, a skink priest able to peer into the future. This guy is basically the Lizardman version of the Oracle of Delphi. He hasn't really got a ton of lore, he's just kind of mentioned, but he's a skink that's revered like he was a slan, so he's done pretty well for himself. He foresaw an attempt on Mazdamundi's life, sending Oxyotl after the assassins, and he predicted Clan Pestilence returning to the city that they'd fortified in ages past, Quetzal. He's basically just a character to fill in the fact that there's not really any cheap, good skink mages, I think. But, what would I know? I don't write lore. Tic-tac-toe. Yes, I'm not kidding. A skink with a pun that's worse than Lord Croak for a name. This guy rides a pterodon into battle. Pterodons fly through the air. They're like flying dinosaur creatures. Basically pterodactyls. And this guy is pretty much a Lizardmen Red Baron. So the astute among you will notice that for some of these characters I didn't touch on any end times lore or their fate. And that's because some of them just don't have any end times lore, or their fate is left unclear. I'm not sure if that's because they aren't sure what they're going to do with the Lizardmen yet. It's possible, because the whole thing is that they've gone on an exodus, basically. So it's possible that it'll be wrapped up in the final End Times book, or perhaps in the next edition. We just don't know. I do apologize also for some of the vagueness in the video, but a lot of that is down to simply there not being any lore for the Lizardmen. They're a very interesting faction, but they don't get a ton of exposition in the form of lore, mainly because they're meant to be mysterious. They're not meant to be known. They're kind of like the Skaven. People don't really admit they exist, or if they do, they're dismissed usually as being crazy. So I do hope that despite that, you have enjoyed the video, and will join me for the next one in this particular lore series. So until then, this is Grey Hunter, signing out, and thank you for watching.